The orchestra had not yet finished the final note when Lord Finch stopped me from leaving. Not with words, with his hand. He caught my wrist mid-step, firm enough to halt me, deliberate enough for everyone to see. The force turned me slightly back toward him, the silk of my gown pulling with the motion. Gasps didn't erupt all at once. They spread, sharp, staggered, unmistakable. He had just prevented a Duchess from walking away, in public. "My dear Duchess," Finch said, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom, wrapped in a mockery of concern. "Surely you're not leaving so soon." His thumb pressed against the inside of my wrist, right where a pulse betrays itself. It was not restraint disguised as courtesy. It was possession, performed for an audience. Fans stilled, conversations fractured. Every gaze tilted toward us, the grieving heiress being held in place by the man who had already begun behaving as if her fortune belonged to him. They expected resistance, a protest. A scene. I gave them none. I let him hold me there. I let the silence deepen. And then, slowly, I turned my head, not toward him, but toward the room. Let them see it. Let them misunderstand. From across the ballroom, I felt it before I saw it. The sharp, unrelenting focus of Duke Ravenscroft. He wasn't watching Finch. He was watching me, waiting, measuring, trying to understand why I wasn't pulling away, why I wasn't stopping this, why I was allowing it. His confusion was the only honest reaction in the room, because this was not happening to me. This was happening because of me. Finch believed he had just stopped my exit, that he had claimed me in front of the court, that he had taken control of the narrative. He was wrong. I had timed my step, calculated the distance, waited for his hand, and when it came, I did exactly what I intended to do, nothing. Because the most powerful move a woman can make in a room full of witnesses is to allow the wrong man to believe he has already won. His hand remained on my arm far longer than propriety allowed. At the formal dinner that followed, Lord Finch seated me himself, a public gesture of shepherding a lost lamb. He suggested my wine, commented on my plate, his words weaving a cage of solicitous concern around me. Every lord and lady at the long table saw it. They saw the wolf gentling the sheep before the slaughter. I inclined my head, offered faint smiles, and allowed it all. This display of meekness was essential. But it was Duke Ravenscroft's attention I was truly holding. Seated opposite, his gaze was a physical weight, sharp and assessing. He wasn't watching Finch. He was watching my reaction, and my lack of one was a puzzle he could not yet solve. Our next encounter was in the library 2 hours later. I was examining a nautical map of my father's trade routes when his shadow fell over the parchment. He had not approached by chance. His steps were silent and deliberate. "You are either the most naive woman at court," Duke Ravenscroft said, his voice a low counterpoint to the crackling fire, "or the most dangerous." He stood close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from the signet ring on his hand. This was the moment to retreat, to create space. Instead, I leaned slightly forward, my fingers tracing a shipping lane to the Orient. "And which do you believe me to be, Your Grace?" I asked, not looking up. The illusion had to be perfect. A hint of vulnerability, a dash of defiance, the classic cocktail of a woman in over her head, intrigued by the one man who saw through her act. He expected fear or flirtation. I gave him calm curiosity. His silence was a victory. I had presented him with 2 options, and he was beginning to suspect there was a third he hadn't yet considered. The following afternoon, I took a walk through the yew maze. It was a calculated risk, a stage set for an audience of 1. As I knew he would, he found me at the center, by a stone sundial. "Your performance with Finch is convincing," he stated, dispensing with pleasantries. "He believes he has you completely under his thumb." "Does he?" I asked, feigning a mild surprise that I knew would irritate him. He stepped into my space, blocking the sun. "He boasts of it. He tells everyone the Whitmore heiress is compliant, malleable." He paused, his eyes searching mine. You are neither. This was it. The crack in his composure. The confirmation that my contradictory signals were working. He was no longer a passive observer. He was an active investigator. I allowed a small, sad smile to touch my lips, a tool I despised but used with precision. A woman in my position must learn to appear as she is needed. I let the sentence hang in the air, a confession that could mean anything. Then I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the heart of the maze. He thought our encounters were a series of fortunate chances, of him catching me in unguarded moments. He was wrong. They were invitations, and he had accepted everyone. Lord Finch did not wait to be invited into my father's study. He installed himself there. By the time I arrived that morning, the doors were already open, the fire lit, and his coat draped over the back of my father's chair, as if the room had accepted him as its new master overnight. Duke Ravenscroft stood near the window, silent, watching, always watching. "Ah," Finch said as I entered, not rising. "Perfect timing. I've taken the liberty of reviewing your father's accounts." Taken the liberty. I crossed the room slowly, my fingers trailing across the edge of the desk before I sat. The ledgers were already open, columns marked, sections folded, numbers circled in red ink like wounds that had been carefully selected. "Debts," he continued smoothly, tapping one page, "considerable ones. Your father was less cautious than society believed." A murmur, just faint enough to be plausible deniability, came from the doorway. Servants. Listening. Good. I leaned forward, studying the page as if trying to understand it. "This one," I said quietly, letting my finger rest on a single line. "The Caspian acquisition." Finch's smile didn't falter. Not yet. "My father referenced it differently," I added, tilting my head slightly, "as a joint venture, with the Ravenscroft Syndicate." The room shifted. It was subtle, but real. Finch's fingers stopped tapping. Across the room, Ravenscroft didn't move, but something in his posture changed, sharpened, focused, and Finch noticed. Of course he did. "Your father," Finch said, slower now, "had a tendency to romanticize his arrangements." His tone had changed, not paternal, defensive. I looked up at him for the first time. Did he? Silence. A dangerous one. For a fraction of a second, Finch's gaze flicked toward Ravenscroft. It was enough. That was the crack, not the answer, the reaction. Ravenscroft saw it too. I didn't need to turn to know. The air between them had tightened. Something unspoken, something exposed. Finch recovered quickly, his smile returning just a shade too sharp. "These matters are complex," he added, "and perhaps not the best concern for you at present." Dismissal, control reasserted, but too late. The illusion had already slipped. I let my hand withdraw from the page, as if the numbers had overwhelmed me. I lowered my gaze, allowing just enough silence to suggest retreat. Let him believe it worked. Behind me, I heard movement. Ravenscroft. He crossed the room, not toward Finch, but toward the desk, toward me. He stopped just short of my shoulder, close enough to feel, not close enough to claim. "Curious," he said, his voice calm, almost idle. "The Caspian venture was dissolved years ago." Finch didn't answer immediately, which in a room like this was an answer. I rose slowly, gathering the edge of my gloves between my fingers as if the conversation no longer concerned me. But as I passed Finch, I paused, just briefly, long enough for only him to hear. "My father kept records," I said softly. Then I walked out. I did not look back, but I didn't need to, because behind me, the silence had changed, and this time, it wasn't mine. The note burned like a hot coal in my pocket. It confirmed my suspicions but provided no public proof. It was a key without a lock. I had to force Finch or Ravenscroft to reveal the location of that lock themselves. The annual autumn equinox ball, a glittering affair of obligatory celebration, provided the stage. I found them both in the card room, a den of calculated risks and quiet power plays. Lord Finch was holding court, expansive and confident. Duke Ravenscroft watched the game, his face an unreadable mask of stone. I approached their table, allowing a calculated tremor in my hand as I accepted a glass of champagne. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice pitched to carry just enough. "I've been reading my father's philosophical texts. He often wrote that a man's true legacy isn't in his vaults, but in the hands of a neutral guardian, a trusted friend who holds his honor in safekeeping." The shuffling of cards ceased. Lord Finch laughed, a sound too loud for the room. "How poetic, and how naive. Your father's honor is in my hands now, my dear, and I assure you it is quite safe." But his eyes betrayed a flicker of something cold, fear. He glanced at Ravenscroft, a silent, anxious question passing between them. He was probing to see if the Duke was this mysterious guardian. Before Ravenscroft could respond, the Dowager Countess Beatrice, a woman whose tongue was sharper than any dueling sword, spoke from a nearby settee. "One would think you were already the master of Whitmore, Lord Finch," she observed, her voice dripping with acidic sweetness. "Your attentiveness is so thorough. It borders on ambition." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Public suspicion, once a whisper, was now a voice. Reputations were being weighed on the scales of gossip. Finch's face flushed a dangerous red. He had built his reputation on the illusion of benevolence. The first stone had just been thrown at his glass house. Later, as the orchestra played, Ravenscroft led me to a secluded alcove overlooking the gardens. His grip on my elbow was firm, his patience gone. "The neutral guardian," he said, his voice a low growl. "That was not a random comment. You know something. Stop this charade." The time for games was over. He needed to be an ally, not a variable. "My father left a note," I admitted. "He confirmed Finch owes our estate. It mentions the full account rests with a guardian." I watched him process this, saw the pieces click into place in his sharp mind. This was the moment his hunt and my own would finally merge. "It's worse than you think," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I haven't been observing Finch out of mere curiosity. I've been tracking his finances for 6 months. He is insolvent. He hasn't just been fabricating your family's debt. He has been systematically embezzling from 3 other noble houses, using your father's good name as collateral for his schemes. He isn't trying to save himself from a bad investment. He's trying to avoid utter ruin and a traitor's prison." This revelation was staggering. This was not just a private war. It was a conspiracy that threatened the stability of the peerage. But as I absorbed the scale of Finch's desperation, Ravenscroft delivered the final chilling blow, the twist that changed everything. "The note you found," he asked, his eyes locking onto mine, dark and serious. "What were your father's exact words about being silenced?" "He wrote, 'If I am silenced,'" I whispered, the words suddenly tasting of ash. Ravenscroft's face was grim. "Your father's physician, Dr. Alcott, a man of unfortunate habits and deep gambling debts. Lord Finch was generous enough to settle them all, in full, the day after he signed the death certificate declaring your father died of a weak heart. The knowledge that my father was murdered did not break me. It forged me. Grief became a whetstone, sharpening my intent to a razor's edge. My strategy shifted from defense to a quiet, suffocating offense. Lord Finch and his accomplices believed they were nearing the end of their game. They were merely walking deeper into mine. My first target was the weakest link, Dr. Alcott. I encountered him at a morning music hall, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a teacup. I approached him with an expression of earnest concern. "Doctor," I said, my voice pitched for the Dowager Countess and 2 other gossips to overhear, "I've been compiling my father's papers. I find his decline was so sudden. I've taken the liberty of engaging a specialist from Vienna to review your notes. For posterity, of course, to ensure medical history properly honors the swiftness of your diagnosis." The clink of Alcott's teaspoon against his saucer was deafening in the sudden quiet. His face went the color of spoiled milk. He stammered something about professional privilege, his eyes darting around the room for an escape. It was not an accusation. It was a promise. I had placed a spotlight on him, and he knew a Viennese specialist would find the truth in a heartbeat. The whispers that followed him out of the room were no longer about my fragility. They were about his incompetence, or worse. Next was Finch himself. My passivity was replaced by a precise, surgical aggression disguised as deference. At a political dinner, surrounded by ministers of trade, I turned to him with a hopeful smile. "Lord Finch, you've been so generous in managing the fleet. Perhaps you could enlighten the minister on our strategy for mitigating the demurrage costs at the port of Antioch?" My father's last correspondence on the matter was quite complex. I had spent 2 days studying the topic. It was an obscure but critical piece of maritime finance. Finch, who had only ever cared about bottom-line figures, froze. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a fish gasping for air. He could not answer. Before the awkward silence could become a fatal wound, Duke Ravenscroft spoke, his voice cool and cutting. "Lord Finch concerns himself with the grand overview," he said, saving and damning him in the same breath. "The minutiae are perhaps best left to the experts." The implication was clear. Finch was a figurehead, not a master. The illusion of his competence was shattering. The social environment was electric. Every eye in the room was now watching our lethal triangle, sensing that a great house was either on the brink of collapse or revival. The final move was a public declaration. I hosted a somber dinner to announce the creation of a charitable trust in my father's name. As the port was being served, I stood. "To honor my father's legacy of integrity," I announced to the silent room, "I have commissioned a full and transparent audit of the Whitmore estate and all its holdings, to be conducted by the Crown's most rigorous accountants. Every ledger, every partnership, every debt and credit will be laid bare for public record." I raised my glass, my eyes finding Finch's across the long table. His face was a mask of cracking porcelain. I had just signed his death warrant. An audit would expose everything. Ravenscroft gave a slow, deliberate nod. He understood. I had just sent a public summons to the neutral guardian. They now had a choice: produce the real ledger and be seen as a hero who saved the Whitmore name, or remain silent and be implicated as a conspirator in the crime of the century. The game was no longer about discovery. It was about survival, and I had just set the board on fire. The Sovereign's Gala was the apex of the social season, a glittering arena where reputations were made or annihilated under the glare of 1,000 candles. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Everyone was watching. They knew the audit I had announced was a declaration of war, and they were waiting for the first casualty. They did not have to wait long. Cornered and desperate, Lord Finch made his final, fatal move. He approached me near the grand staircase, his face a mask of feigned concern, but his voice, loud enough for half the room to hear, was laced with venom. "Your Grace," he boomed, a theatrical sorrow in his tone. "This talk of audits, of investigations, it is the talk of a mind unbalanced by grief. You are unwell. As your father's dearest friend, I must insist, for your own protection, that you cede control of the estate until you have recovered." A collective gasp swept the room. The music faltered. It was the ultimate gambit, a public accusation of madness. He was attempting to discredit me entirely, to nullify my every action with a single brutal label. The court held its breath, expecting tears, a hysterical denial, the final collapse of the fragile Duchess Whitmore. I did not speak. I simply waited. From the edge of the crowd, a figure detached himself. It was Lord Ashworth, my father's oldest and most trusted friend. He was the neutral guardian. He walked calmly into the circle of silence, holding a simple leather-bound book, the ledger. "Lord Finch is correct about one thing," Ashworth said, his voice calm and resolute, cutting through the silence. "The Duchess is unwell. She has been made sick by the web of lies surrounding her father's death." He opened the ledger. "This book, left in my safekeeping, proves the Whitmore estate is owed a fortune by Lord Finch. It also details his fraudulent use of the Whitmore name to secure loans he could never repay. He paused, letting the words sink in. And it contains a final entry logged the day before his death. A record of payment to a certain Dr. Alcott, made from a secret account belonging to Lord Finch. The silence that followed was not one of suspense, but of judgment. It was a physical force, pressing down on Alistair Finch from all sides. His face crumpled, the mask of the benevolent lord dissolving to reveal the terrified, ruined man beneath. He looked around, but every face was turned away. He had ceased to exist. Royal guards, who had been waiting discreetly, stepped forward. They did not touch him. They simply flanked him, their presence a silent, final verdict. As they escorted him from the ballroom, a path cleared before them as if he were a leper. The inversion was complete. Power had not been transferred. It had been revealed. It had been mine all along. The whispers in the aftermath were different. Pity had been replaced by a wary admiration, and every glance held a new question. What else did she know? Lord Finch's name was erased from the rolls of the peerage, his fall a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. Dr. Alcott vanished into disgraced obscurity. The houses Finch had defrauded now owed me not money, but a debt of silence and allegiance. I had not just saved my family's fortune, I had rebalanced the scales of power across the entire aristocracy. Duke Ravenscroft and I rarely spoke of that night. We did not need to. An understanding now existed between us, an alliance forged not in words, but in shared silence and mutual victory. When our eyes met across a crowded room, we saw not a potential partner in romance, but a peer who understood the true cost of control. He had sought vengeance for his family's honor, I, justice for my father's life. We had both achieved our aims. The court had once watched a tragedy unfold, believing me to be its victim. Now they understood they had never seen the full play. They finally saw me not as the fragile girl who inherited a title, but as the woman who commanded it. They thought the world had happened to me. They were wrong. My father taught me that the world is a stage. He never told me I was meant to be its architect.